Okay. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. So we'll do a little overview of this today of what our course is going to be about, what the emphasis is going to be on, the text we're going to be using in that. And it'll develop as we go along. But basically the text we're going to use is this Profound Buddhism from Hinayana to Vajrayana by Kalu Rinpoche. It's out of Clear Point Press. And there's still some floating around available on Amazon and maybe some other places, I don't know. Just to give you an idea of it, it's
If you can't get them through Amazon, let us know, because I did make inquiries into the distributor for Press, but we have to set up a place.
Yeah, if you can't find one, let us know, because we have some resources. But this is teachings of Kalu Rinpoche, and I'm dating myself a little bit here, but Kalu Rinpoche passed away in 1989. He was born in eastern Tibet in 1904. He's the Lama of the Kagyu Shangpa lineage. So again, this gets a little esoteric for all of us, but basically there are 4 main lineage traditions in Tibet. The oldest one is the Nyingma, and it really means like the ancient ones, Nyingmapa, followers of the ancient way. They're all based basically on when their teachings came from India to Tibet. And Nyingma, I think it's the 800s when it came, 800s, 900s, something like that. Then it's called the Old School. Then there are 3 new schools, which are the Kagyu, Sakya, and Gelugpa. Let's start with Shakya. Shakya is a familial lineage, so it's father to son. And some of the first lamas who came to Tibet, Daishung Rinpoche had a position at, I think it was Seattle University or the University of Washington or Vancouver. I can't remember exactly, somewhere there in Washington State. And was a great Lama, highly respected, and one of the first. And now the Sakya people, like their headquarters are downstate New York, just north of New York City, I believe. I think they have a temple there. And then at one point they were the rulers of Tibet a long time ago. So those are the Sakyas. And if I'm not mistaken, Sakya means gray. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. It just, the head monastery in Tibet, you look at a picture of it, it's color picture, but it looks like it's in black and white because the earth is gray. Sometimes, thank you, I noticed, sometimes the Tibetan names and that sort of strike me like Native Americans, where it's like Blue Eagle, it's very direct kind of descriptions. All right, so that's the Sakya, Nyingma, Sakya. Next one, and I'll skip over the Kagyu, although that's the next one. We'll go to Gelugpa. Gelugpa, I think, means shining virtue. And that's the tradition the Dalai Lamas are in. Traditionally, the Dalai Lamas were the second in rank in the Gelugpa, believe it or not. The head of the Gelugpa was someone who was head of Tanden Monastery. It means Tushita in Tibetan, Tushita in Sanskrit. Can't remember. We drove by it when we were in Tibet. Find this monastery, but you've got someone with an old mind these days. And then the Kagyu. So the Kagyu, Ka means speech, Gyu means secret speech, esoteric tradition. The Kagyu comes from the Buddha Vajradhara, holder of the Vajra, transmitted to Tilopa, this Indian guru, transmitted to Naropa, who had been like the president of Harvard University, president of Nalanda University, and then went on his own spiritual quest, gave up everything. So he received the teachings, transmission from Tilopa. Then Tilopa passed it to Marpa, the first Tibetan to have this particular transmission. Marpa then to Milarepa, his most famous student, Milarepa to Gampopa. And then from Gampopa, 4 main teachers. And one of those is Pagmodrupa, and he's in our lineage. So it went to Pagmodrupa and then to Jigten Sumgun. So most of our teachings come through Jigten Sumgun. There are 12 subsects of the Kagyu. Some of them don't really exist anymore. I don't know. Some are very small. And one of those was the Shangpa Kagyu, which Kalu Rinpoche was the lineage holder of. Born in Eastern Tibet in 1904, studied and practiced with many great beings of all traditions before living in solitary retreat for 12 years. One of the first Tibetan masters to teach in the West, passed away in 1989. All right. He made 3 trips, I think, to the United States and used to have a little Dharma center that was founded down in downstate New York, also just north of New York City. I don't know that it exists anymore. I've heard tapes of some of the teachings that he gave when he came to the States. He came first and taught on self-liberation, the Hinayana, the smaller vehicle. Then his second trip, he taught on the conventional Mahayana. And the third trip, he taught on the Vajrayana. So he did this remarkable kind of unfolding of the teachings. So this book that we're using of his teachings collection, Profound Buddhism, it's teaching how to deal with the emotions from a self-liberation, a Hinayana point of view, Mahayana point of view, conventional Mahayana, and the unconventional Mahayana, the Vajrayana point of view, because we're all completely rich in emotions and they typically dominate the mind. How can we use these things, the energies of these emotions? So this includes teachings on the nature of mind, the relationship between mind and body, emptiness, compassion, and the situation of the individual in the cycle of existence and karma. So I found it a really wonderful book. Kalu Rinpoche, a great teacher, and I like the sort of expanse of it. And yet, as you'll see in the book, each section is very short, so it's very approachable and useful. Kind of book you can open up anywhere, and where your lights is useful. And then secondarily, I wanted to use something on the actual story of the Buddha, the oldest text that we have, usually in Pali language, about his life. It's very fascinating when you read the stories of his life, because first of all, they're written hundreds of years after he actually lived. And interestingly, there's a whole cosmological, and you could say mythical structure to this, which tends to get ignored for us in America. We tend to think that the history is the real thing, and the other stuff is just kind of like, I don't know what we think about it. But I've always thought that, when you're trying to communicate truth that is beyond your conceptual understanding, how do you do that? So I don't see the myths as being, just symbolic or just sort of representing some mind states or whatever. We do this interesting thing where you have academics in the West, and basically they hear any of the mythic kind of stories. And of course, they sort of reject that with their own teachings, but they want to be open at the same time. And so they deign to try to explain this. So they'll take to Buddhists, whether Tibetans or Japanese or Chinese or wherever, and you have these Western teachers trying to explain Buddhism to the Buddhists. It's really a very kind of funny thing, but I think fundamentally it's limited. And the power of the myth is, if you think about it, if you want to just be highly, highly objective, scientific, is super rational. And, what do you say to someone? Do you say, well, I'm hungry as a wolf, which is a mythic statement? Or do you say, the pH of my stomach right now is 7.6? Some truths are so, you might say, vivid or so powerful that we need mythic language to express them. But that doesn't mean that the myths are a lie. It's just that the truth is more than our rational mind can encompass. And yet at the same time, it's not about blind belief. So we don't just, say, okay, I'm just accepting all of this on face value. No, rather it comes, the understanding comes, the genius of the Buddha Dharma. The understanding comes through practice. That's so amazing because it's open to everybody. And the teachings are there and you test them, so to speak. And so we don't, it's like Mama Tarchin would say, it's like you find yourself in the middle of the ocean and you're floundering, your boat has sunk. And somehow here comes someone along and throws a life raft. And, one of those circular lifesavers. Of course, you grab onto it. We don't do in this intellectual way, well, I only, believe in yellow life rafts. So I'm going to reject this one. No, when you have some degree of understanding, everyone that comes to Buddhism does, of the first noble truth. The fact that everything is dissatisfactory, even involving suffering. When we are grabbed by that, and we have this sinking feeling that there's no sort of magic solution that we can do, whether in reputation or a relationship or wealth or knowledge or whatever, that's the first noble truth. It's kind of a scary place to be, to really accept it. And of course, it's a very deep place where people actually do completely accept it. But nonetheless, knowing that I'm in this suffering state, we of course grab onto the life raft. And there's plenty of time while we're riding that raft to see whether it's valid. Is it keeping us above the waves? Is there some way that it could be done better? Is it not doing what you thought it was going to do? What is actually going on there? But it comes out of experience, not just believing. And yet at the same time, there has to be some degree of belief, of course, otherwise we don't find ourselves involved in anything. So I think the Buddha's stories are going to be very helpful too, because I really think it's like the farther you go with this, the simple stories of the Buddha become more and more profound. And at the same time, you get this sense, because even though you can't really be proven historically, at the same time, the stories of the Buddha, you get this feeling of this, this powerful personality, in the sense, like not a personality, beyond personality, but the various occasions of his life are, of course, tremendous inspiration, but also teach. They teach. And the mythic side, which, happy for the Tibetans, this is the full range of the Buddha Dharma. It's what the Tibetans have preserved. That's especially valuable to us, because instead of sort of picking and choosing and trying to weed out all the aspects of the Buddha Dharma that you think, you'd rather not have to deal with somehow, instead you take it in its fullness, and where there's not understanding, that's okay. We just keep working. There can be really strong doubts, and you just don't let them torpedo the boat, so to speak. There's so many ways of confronting those things when they need to be confronted. There are lamas that teach through kempos, your own study, your own deep thinking, questioning other people, looking deeply into the source of that doubt. But at the same time, it's all right to just put the doubt aside. Let it be there. In the end, I believe all these things are resolvable, but they're also resolved without sort of obsessing over it necessarily. But you never know. Everybody's path is different. Sometimes people, like in certain of the Zen practices, they're trying to raise the great doubt. Like, what is the meaning of this? And boring into that doubt until you reach a state of not knowing, which is the exhaustion of the conceptual mind. When the conceptual mind is stilled, the true nature appears. So there's no end to the skillful methods of the Buddha Dharma. But at any rate, I'm thinking this book to recommend for the stories of the Buddha. We might use several, but the first one that I had read years ago was by Michael Carithers. That's Carrithers, Michael Carithers, and it's called Buddha, a very short introduction. And it's a beautiful little paperback. Okay. So to start on ours, Profound Buddhism, I think it's so helpful because it works with emotions. And this is seemingly so perfect for our time. There's so much, the fact this whole therapeutic kind of therapy culture kind of world that we've created. There's been so much in the West since Sigmund Freud. So people, think about their emotions a lot and live in an emotional world. And the Dharma deals with that, which of course makes it seem very modern. And its understanding of the emotions is so sophisticated, but importantly, useful. Because suddenly, instead of being powerless, suddenly there's just ample of stuff to work with. And yet even the fact of recognizing the emotions lessens their power over you and the ability to throw people around, so to speak. So, reading from the introduction, the three teachings that give the basic principles that define the three vehicles, the small vehicle, the great vehicle, and the diamond vehicle. So it's Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana. Teachings detail the way of processing conflicting emotions in the framework of each of these approaches and give practical exercises. To follow what's going to be taught, it's necessary to first understand the term emotion, that is to say, conflicting emotion, as it's expressed in Buddhism. It is clear here that the word emotion is used in a sense somewhat different from its usual Western meaning. So, for example, the emotion provided by a movie, a poem, or a beautiful landscape is located on a level other than our conflicting emotions. So we typically here use the term the afflictions, the afflictive emotions, the ones that are like assailing you. So again, it's an important distinction because sometimes people think, emotions, I can't feel any joy. I'm supposed to be some sort of like a dead automaton or something, but that's not it. In addition, some mental factors categorized as afflicting emotions, like blindness or pride, are indeed not considered emotions in conventional speech. So our own arrogance for Buddhism is a conflicting emotion. It's an afflictive emotion. But normally in English, we don't think of, pride as being an emotion. There is no exact equivalent in contemporary French or English of the Sanskrit term klesha, and that's the technical term, or the Tibetan nyon mongpa. For these reasons, conflicting or afflictive emotion is not a perfect equivalent, and passion, covering the Buddhist notion of klesha almost precisely in the classic theological language, has a very different meaning today. So again, sometimes you see in old, Christian texts too, when they talk about passion, but we put a modern meaning on that, and it can be a little bit misleading. Because we have no better terminology, we'll use conflicting emotion as a generic term for desire, attachment, hatred, aversion, blindness, ignorance, possessiveness, jealousy, and pride, with all their nuances. To understand what conflicting emotion means in all these teachings, necessary to keep in mind the specific use of this term in Buddhism. So the precision of these teachings is very helpful Speaking from my own very limited experience, but still, 15 years in Western Zen, and speaking for myself, I felt very much at home there, happy, and no complaints. And yet, the extensive teachings, which are in Zen in Japan, or Chan as it's called in China, are there. I mean, for instance, the teacher of the teacher, who was the teacher of the founder of the Rochester Zen Center. So, man who founded the Rochester Zen Center, Japanese teacher, his Japanese teacher had a PhD in Buddhist studies, and yet was known in Japan as being this kind of very ascetic, solid kind of practitioner, with tremendous emphasis on practice more than the teachings. But the teachings are so helpful because it gives us something to think about, and they're also guides. Well, there's a reason that all those teachings are out there. In fact, in our own way, the great teacher Nagarjuna said that if you divide the teachings between the absolute teachings and the conventional relative teachings, that the relative teachings were more important, because by engaging with those, we're led to the absolute, so to speak. Now, all that's a conceptual framework, but it helps to give people confidence, and all of that, therefore, helpful. All right. Well, in Buddhism, there's a division of three vehicles: the small vehicle, Hinayana; the great vehicle, Mahayana; the diamond vehicle, Vajrayana. The hierarchy established between these different approaches, also known as lesser, greater, and superior vehicles, does not refer to economic or social status, but concerns the spiritual capacities of the practitioner, or the greater or lesser breadth of his or her vision. The small vehicle, and so first we're going to look at the small vehicle, the technically called the Hinayana. Important to understand, this is not this is talking about the motivation of self-liberation. It's not describing any particular school or tradition within Buddhism. You can be saying that, gee, I'm here in a Vajrayana center, and yet if your motivation is I'm just trying to, my whole purpose in this, forget about other sentient beings, I'm just trying to save my skin, so to speak, then you're practicing the Hinayana. So you can practice any of these teachings in a self-liberation kind of way. But as we'll see as we go through the text, the self-liberation leads to and is enfolded into conventional Mahayana, which at the same time is completely folded into the exceptional Mahayana, the Vajrayana, and there's no contradiction there. So the small vehicle is based on becoming aware of the fact that all we experience in samsara is marked by suffering. Being aware of this engenders the will to rid ourselves of this suffering, to liberate ourselves on an individual level, and to attain happiness. We are moved by our own interest. Renunciation and perseverance allow us to attain our goal. When Kalu Rinpoche's first trip to the United States, he was describing the vehicle of self-liberation, what kind of practices are done there. And he mentioned certain kinds of concentration practices which lead to an insight. But the primary motivation, again, is to rid ourselves of our own suffering, to come to some sort of awakening or realization. And I realized that he was very much describing what I had been doing. And that was so helpful to feel that there's like this sort of structure that, you could have confidence, because it means that your own experience, aspirations, whatever, is not just some sort of narcissistic thing that you're banging around in the universe with, but rather it relates to other people. And there are people who have walked this path and therefore can be relied on. It's like trying to learn tennis. You can just go out and try to make everything up on your own. Or what happens? Someone who's really interested maybe they get a book. Eventually, they get a teacher. They even know the history and the struggles of past people. It's all very natural. There's something to learn. And so, although it's true at the highest levels, you can hear these wonderful statements is that, the path of no more learning. Yes, but you're not at the path of no more learning. So it doesn't do any good to pretend that there's no more learning when you have a whole lot to learn. It's just another form of ignorance. So I used to tell this story of, years ago, remember when, what's the TV show, CGI? Is that what they are? They had this whole series of people that were doing CSI. Yes, thank you. Yeah, they did made a big deal about forensics, and I've had judges tell me that that kind of ruined the jury pool forever because everyone in the jury now is looking for things to be decided 100% because the TV gave them that. Well, anyway, I don't know if you remember, they had one actor, I can't remember his name, and he was this kind of socially awkward but brilliant kind of guy. That was his character. And he was always saying sort of inappropriate things or sometimes like really smart things, but he was way over the heads of everyone else there. And so it was like that. That was his character. And at one point in the series, he said, "If you meet the Buddha, kill him," which is the statement of a Chinese master in the Tang dynasty, which is extremely profound. You can't, these concepts eventually, it's your own pure experience of your mind, like beyond concept. So that's a wonderful thing to say. But for that guy to say it on TV wasn't the right time for it. That was said historically to someone who, kind of shocked them into awakening. Because you have someone who has had tremendous dedication, can you imagine, to these concepts and is trying to internalize them and learn them and practice them again and again and again. And then there's something they call like the golden chain. We have chains of iron, our ordinary emotions and kleshas. But then there's the golden chain, where you start to think, oh, I'm having some pretty good concentration here. And you start thinking of yourself as being superior to others. That's the golden chain. And so there are all sorts of wonderful stories of teachers kind of like pulling the rug out from underneath you, this self-created rug that we do to really actually protect ourselves, sort of feed the ego in a funny way. So at any rate, if you meet the Buddha, kill him. So it helps to have these teachings and to see the gradual path. It gives confidence. And it also destroys the kind of pride that can come from this kind of formless kind of, teaching unsupported by knowledge. Actually, the head of one of the major sects of Zen Buddhism in Japan said to do Zazen, the main meditation of Zen, without knowledge is basically pointless. We can't run away from the need for ourselves to understand. It doesn't mean you have to become a PhD or something, but at the same time, to whatever degree of knowledge we need, it's there for us in this breadth of the Buddha Dharma. The famous story in the Buddha's lifetime of one monk who just could not memorize anything. They were trying to teach him mantra, and he just couldn't, the simplest mantra, he just couldn't do it. He kept goofing it up. And the other monks sort of got impatient with him and just kind of rejected him. But the Buddha, of course, with his higher perception, knew what was going on. And so he took the monk to the temple and said, "Here's what I want you to do. Take this broom, and you see this dust on the floor? I want you to sweep the dust away so there's no dust. You do the north side first, and then you do the south side of the temple." So he does this in the north side. Then he goes to the south side, sweeps it all. He's being very diligent, mindful, concentrated, sweep, 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 sweep. And he gets done and he turns around and somehow there's dust on the north side again that the Buddha could do, kind of like magically. And because he had such dedication, and you can see the glimmerings of bodhicitta, I mean, he was doing this for the rest of the Sangha, he just kept sweeping. And then again, dust on the other side. He kept going back and forth, and lo and behold, he comes to awakening. So the Buddha knew this skillfully, how to do this. So this man was not like some sort of, conceptual genius, but he still had the method of which seems like a lower practice. What do you mean just sweep the floor? The first time I spent time with Lama Tarchin was a month in outside of Napa Valley, California. And there was a brilliant guy there who was a postdoctoral fellow at the Rockefeller Institute. I mean, again, an IQ off the charts, but totally socially ill at ease. Really interesting guy. And people started becoming alienated by him during the month. We were there for a whole month. And there was a lot of social interaction too. It wasn't just silent meditation. And they started kind of, like people do, isolating, rejecting him. And the last 2.5 weeks of the month were just Nundro. And Lama Tarchin was giving instructions every day outside in this walnut tree grove, California, so beautiful. And he was giving instructions on Nundro how to do prostrations, and everyone was just standing around listening to him. And I noticed Paul, this brilliant guy, was actually physically standing apart from everybody, just distance enough. You could see kind of the alienation happening. And in the midst of everything, Lama Tarchin looked at him and directed to him directly and said, do you want to be a bodhisattva? And he said, well, what do you mean? You want to be bodhisattva? I can make you bodhisattva. He said, well, okay, what do I have to do? Well, here. He gave him a bucket and rubber gloves and a little stick like a trowel, a little shovel, because we were outside and there was poison oak everywhere. In fact, people were getting this itching from the poison oak, and it was in the dust even. It was summertime in California. And Lama Tarchin was making jokes. He called this it was Ati Ling. That was the name of the retreat place where Ati is highest place. Ati Ling refers to Dzogchen. At any rate, Lama Tarchin called this the Ati Ling Mudra, and I'm scratching myself like a monkey, scratching my ribs. This is the Ati Ling Mudra. So he said, Paul, get a bucket, take these rubber gloves and this little trowel, and I want you, every time you walk around here and you see some poison oak, you dig it up and get it out of the path or wherever it is. And I thought to myself, Mr. Big Zen guy, right? I thought to myself, oh, what a bunch of baloney that is. This is like some lower thing, digging around with a shovel. I mean, that's not really Buddhism. These are all the negative thoughts in the mind. Well, for the rest of the 2 weeks, you saw Paul, he'd be walking around and he'd spot some poison oak and he would throw himself down with like complete involvement and digging it up for the benefit of the whole place. And I felt so humbled because I realized how skillful these methods are, how skillful these teachers are. They're relating to that person's mind directly, not through some book of here's how you do it. And in the midst of this was like aware of the whole social dynamic that was going on. And all these people that somehow was like seemingly flowing and working better for, and yet, of course, had this klesha of somehow excluding this guy in the subtle ways that human beings do, these kinds of little cruelties. So it was a teaching, it was like a beginning teaching on bodhicitta. So we'll get into that with the Mahayana, but nonetheless. We are moved by our own interest. Renunciation and perseverance allow us to attain our goal. The complete awakening attained by Shakyamuni Buddha was the result of a long process unfolding over many lives. At the origin of this path, he took a vow from a Buddha of the past to become awakened for the benefit of all beings. Then, for numberless kalpas, he practiced the 6 paramitas, the 6 perfections, which are the 6 qualities that allow progress on the path, always keeping in mind the thought of benefiting others. His bodhisattva practice having become infinite, he finally attained full awakening or Buddhahood. This way of envisaging the spiritual progression of Shakyamuni Buddha corresponds to the vision of the great vehicle. For many people, however, it is too vast to be understood. Numerous are the people who perceive it from a Hinayana perspective, that it is then shorter and felt in a more personal context. Here, the path of the Buddha is restricted to what is known of his life on earth, the historical, quote unquote, existence. Born the son of a king in northern India, the future Buddha received an education reserved for princes. He was brilliant in all the disciplines he approached, such as the arts, literature, astrology, sciences, and the chivalric arts. He lived surrounded by female companions, as was customary at the time. With the main one, his spouse, Yashodhara, he had a son. Entirely occupied by the affairs and pleasures of the court until his 30th year, he then became deeply conscious of old age, sickness, and death. This led him to renounce his kingdom and all its privileges, to abandon his court, his family, and his child. Secretly, he left the palace and went to the forest. As a sign of renunciation, he cut his hair and traded his princely clothes for rags. One of the things we'll get into this, because as he said, he's expounding this from the historical point of view. We'll see when we start to talk later, not tonight, but later, about the mythology, the cosmology of this. There are certain amazing kind of resonances, and you see that the mythology is the story too. So, for instance, in Buddha's previous lifetime, he was a prince also, Vesantara. And Vesantara undergoes, through various challenges and crises, becomes an ascetic also, and practices giving, and is the highest example of the perfection of giving. He gives away everything. It's a very moving story, but this was the Buddha, and I think this lifetime right before, maybe two before his historical existence on earth. And in the end becomes a world-conquering Chakravartin, a world-conquering hero. Now we have Shakyamuni also becoming an ascetic, but instead of doing all of this with his family, he rejects his family or leaves his family. And instead of becoming a world-conquering hero, a Chakravartin, he becomes a full Buddha. And the resonances here are kind of fascinating, because in the story of Vesantara, when he leaves his palace as an ascetic, so first of all, what's common is they both got to their path by this sort of rejection of the world, or of the appearance world. The renunciation was the same. But Vesantara travels north on his quest. Shakyamuni, or Gautama at that time, traveled south. One did it with his family, one did it without his family. They're like harmonious, but they're making it harmonious. The two stories together are harmonious. When this Buddha, Gautama, was born, they had, I think he'll relate it in here, there was a great yogi living off in the mountains, and he knew through his psychic ability that this child had been born. And he came to see the child. He wanted to take blessings of this great being. And he, after examining the baby, told Shuddhadana, that is the Buddha's father, that he would either be a Chakravartin, a world-conquering king, or a Buddha. So there it was. Somehow you could read the karma in that way. And of course, we'll get into it later, but Shuddhadana, of course, wanted his son to become the world-conquering hero. So you see those two things linked in the story like that. But when you start to get into the mythology, you realize that it's a deeper part of the story. There's more there. So, this led him to renounce the kingdom and all its privileges, to abandon his court, his family, his child. Secretly, he left the palace, went to the forest. As a sign of renunciation, he cut his hair, traded his princely clothes for rags. From then on, he devoted himself to spiritual practice against the wishes of his father. At the time of his birth, an ascetic had predicted that he would become a king governing the whole earth, or a spiritual master who would help countless beings. The father, in his royal pride, ardently wanted the first of these two destinies fulfilled. To avoid the second alternative, the king had had his son confined to the enclosure of the palace. The exits were watched by guardians night and day. This precaution did not prevent the prince from moving towards his spiritual destiny. When his decision to leave the court was reached, the gods came to help him. They put the guardians to sleep and caused the prince's chariot, led by a coachman, to fly over the walls. The chariot landed at the site of a stupa, and the prince sent the coachman back to the palace. The prince then cut his own hair in order to take up the life of a wandering monk. We have different stories of the Buddha's life too, which is interesting. They're differing accounts. Extremely similar, but sometimes there are slight differences. It's said, for instance, that this Indian god who was appearing as his charioteer, driving him in the chariot with his favorite horse, and where he cut his hair, crossed the river, and left. When he said goodbye to them all, it said they went back to the palace, and the horse died of a broken heart. For 6 years, he practiced the meditative absorptions referred to as contaminated absorptions. These are meditative states within samsara, classified on 9 levels and differing from the perfectly pure absorptions known as non-contaminated by samsara. After 6 years of asceticism, he went to Bodh Gaya, sitting under the Bodhi tree. He engaged his mind in a meditation beyond samsaric states, attaining nirvana or Buddhahood. After experiencing this ultimate realization, he remained absorbed in meditation for several weeks, actually 7 weeks. He believed that he could not teach his discovery because it was too deep for human beings' understanding. Nevertheless, the great gods of ancient India came and begged him to teach. Brahma presented the Buddha with a gold wheel of 1,000 rays, and Indra offered a white conch. The Buddha, accepting them, agreed to spread the Dharma. I find something like this so helpful too, because he believed he could not teach his discovery because it was too deep for human beings' understanding. Dzongsa Khyentse has said that this hesitation to teach is in itself an expression of the vastness of the Buddha Dharma. I mean, rather, you see in a worldly way what happens, someone makes some discovery like the light bulb or something, and immediately, I'll form a corporation and I'll make $1 million with this great idea that I have. And again, nothing wrong with that. But this is different because he was talking about Buddhahood. He was talking about the end of suffering for all sentient beings. I mean, the enormity of that thought. And it's also helpful because it happens that, each one of us has inspiration from coming across these teachings, even just knowing. It said somewhere that even hearing the name of Shunyata, of the great emptiness, even hearing the name destroys samsara. And yet we're dealing all the time in our daily lives with people that don't have this kind of understanding. And although they're suffering, they haven't gone through the process that you have already, where you've come to the point to see the universality of suffering and the hope, coming across something that's not just your own kind of hope and fear, that there is a path. It's just so remarkable. But we're dealing with people all the time who are basically distracted. And in our own meditation, we start to see the distracted habit of mind that we have. And so therefore, there's more easily understanding of others and compassion for others, because you realize that you're just kind of distracted too. And yet we're training ourselves to see how the afflictions arise and how they actually cloud the mind rather than being some sort of revelation. So these things help. The first ones to receive his teachings were the 5 monks who had been his companions in asceticism. He met them in the deer park at Sarnath, close to Varanasi, and taught the 4 noble truths: the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. He explained what samsara was, what nirvana was, and the way of passing from one to the other. All right. We'll start in next time. Well, let me just do the Four Noble Truths, and then next time we'll start with Hinayana in the West. And then have some question answer discussion. Excuse me. All right, the Four Noble Truths. The first two noble truths, the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, analyze samsara. The second, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, the second especially reveal the origin of suffering. All right, so the first two analyze samsara, the second, the causes. The first two noble truths state that suffering is not fundamentally due to external circumstances, but is caused by a dysfunction of mind that is described in the form of the succession of 12 factors. Forming this chain of 12 interdependent links are ignorance, mental formations, consciousness, name and form, the six senses, contact, sensation, craving, grasping, becoming, birth, and old age, and death. This process of interdependency describes the production and continuity of samsara as an ocean of suffering. The first noble truth reveals the result engendered by the process explained in the second noble truth. These are the three types of sufferings explained in detail by the Buddha. The last two noble truths refer to nirvana. They explain its nature and the methods that allow one to reach it. The Buddha describes the different facets of the Hinayana path under the heading of 37 branches of awakening. They are the 4 complete attentions, the 4 right renunciations, the 4 foundations of miracles, the 5 powers, the 5 forces, the 7 factors of awakening, and the Eightfold Noble Path. More of this will be in the future. In the course of this cycle of Hinayana teachings, the Buddha did not approach the ideas of specific qualities of the Buddhas, nor the 3 bodies of awakening, nor the lands of pure manifestation, pure lands, nor notions envisioned only in the Mahayana. In the framework of Hinayana, the Buddha emphasized personal experience of a state free of all suffering. As indicated in the third noble truth, what is sought is the cessation of suffering and what produces this suffering. Suffering is then transformed into a state of happiness and peace. This goal is called arhathood. Arhat means conqueror. So one who has conquered the kleshas is an arhat. Although not having reached complete awakening, the arhat nevertheless has been liberated from the confines of conflicting emotions and karma. This allows the arhat to dwell in stable inner peacefulness. Okay, good place to stop for tonight. So, any questions or comments on these things? Rogo. Use the mic.
No, just wait. Cool. Thanks, John.
Is there, oh, this is so silly. That's such a dumb question. But the arhat, what's the difference between an arhat and an arya? Are they the same?
Yeah,
no, I think there is something different, but I didn't know anyway.
Yeah, arya means noble.
Ah, there we go. Okay.
So arya, that's why when we call the 4 noble truths, it can mean either, there's some difference of opinion, it can mean either, these are these highest kind of truths, but it can also mean, in a more mythic way, these are the truths of the Aryas. So the noble ones express these as truths. So it means a noble one, and it means one who is not, arhats, bodhisattvas, they're all Aryas.
And, okay. And so as they progress, so these aryas and arhats, they really aren't Buddhas yet.
Arhat is not a Buddha yet.
Okay, that's all right.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Although very, very high state.
Right.
And so one reason that we don't disparage, first of all, you never know where another person is at,
Right.
you know, so you don't disparage anybody.
Yeah.
But when it comes to, kind of funny, because I was told, like in Japan, at least this was true in the 60s, yeah, we're just naturally self-grasping, right? And comparing ourselves all the time. So Mahayana, the great vehicle, well, I'm Mahayana, I'm not a small vehicle, you know, this thing. But supposedly in politicians, sort of similar to the way that our politicians sort of grab onto religious things because, you know, it kind of sounds good, whether they believe it or not.
Yeah.
So it's supposedly the politicians, Japanese, would criticize their opponents as being Hinayana, small vehicle type
great,
person,
great.
whereas I am Mahayana, which is just the opposite,
That's
the
just-
Mahayana mind state.
And so I found it kind of interesting. So it's like there's the subtle self-grasping, and then of course the not so subtle self-grasping.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Wow.
So, for instance, you know, like Kempo had taught just recently the 5 paths to Buddhahood. There's also the 5 paths within the Hinayana. And he could teach on those sometimes too. They're you know, similar, but just a little bit more limited. And the important thing to understand is that you can be on the Bodhisattva path, and you can even be deeply realized Bodhisattva. But until I think it's the 7th or 8th bhumi, I think. So out of the 10 levels of enlightened Bodhisattvas, the 8th level, way up there. Until you reach that level, the Arhat is more deeply enlightened than you. So you never disparage.
Right. I do recall Kempele saying that when he was smacking me around intellectually one day, he's like, Rogo, all Buddhism is the same.
Yeah, right.
It's like,
Yeah, it's all about the mind. The example that's given, though, is that the wisdom, if you can, you know, you make a metaphor of wisdom as light, that the wisdom of an Arhat is like a glowworm or a firefly, whereas the wisdom of a Buddha is said to be like the sun at noon in India.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a little bit daunting, you know, and also humbling, which is good, you know, which is good.
Oh man, you just opened up all the self-grasping stuff I want to. Okay. Okay. Anyone else?
2 questions. Hi.
Mm.
Chakravartin King, the one before the Buddha that you were speaking of,
Vasantara.
Vasantara. When you talk about world conquering hero,
Yeah.
is that right?
That's my translation,
Okay.
or guess at a translation, because I don't know Sanskrit anyway, right?
Is he considered a Buddha, or is he considered on the Bodhisattva continuum?
He's considered in samsara, but is completely like in charge, sort of samsara, worldly power,
Okay.
worldly everything, but from virtue, from positive qualities.
Okay.
So not like a Hitler grabbing all the power like that, but in the sense of, I don't know what would be the example. Some people say that the term even came from Ashoka, who conquered 200 years after the Buddha, unified all of India for the first time.
Right.
And then, you know, became this great example of a wise king. I don't know. Megan would maybe know the history, the stuff that she deals with, but yeah.
And you said 37 branches, and I didn't get what else. You said that word
Right.
of something. You don't
Right.
have to go through all 37 of
I
them.
won't go
again,
through all 37.
But I just wanted to be able
Right.
to look them up afterward and write
Yes.
it down.
37 branches of awakening.
Thank you.
Now that's, again, all the translations, you know, maybe they use a different word. I don't know, the 37, because I recognize some things in here that I have a different term that I use for rather than. And we'll have to find it, because someone explained to me too once why there are 108 beads on the mala. And it has to do with these 37 somehow. They have these amazing kind of combinations. Well, we take the 37 these, and then we add these, and then these, and these, and look, 108. It was kind of beautiful, but I can't remember. I'll find it. It's in the little book I have in the Lotus Sutra. Yeah. More room.
So the virtue.
Hold it. Pass up the.
Being that the virtue to become a world-turning monarch,
Yeah.
I forgot the term you used.
Yeah, chakra card.
And because you've gotten that from your goodness, doing good things, and I assume you're continuing to do good things, does that just perpetuate that state? Do you remain in that? I mean, obviously, it looks like Shakyamuni died. I mean, in his reincarnation, and then he came back again and still struggled with self-clinging, and
If I have the
getting tortured.
if I have the succession correctly, Vesantara passed away and was reborn in Tushita heaven.
Oh, okay.
And then from there descended to this birth as Shakyamuni.
Wow. So you didn't go right to hell.
Yeah. Yeah. No.
Okay,
No.
Oh, because I've always heard that you go after your heavenly birth, you go right to hell because all
Well,
your
it
karma is
depends,
burned off.
depends who you are. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're a totally worldly being in a heavenly realm. and you're
Okay.
just
So that's what I actually wanted to know, is because there seems like there's a get out of jail free card if you actually have the correct view. You don't just burn up all your good karma and then plummet into
I don't know the meaning
running
of
along glass or
but
whatever it is.
the Buddhas are all born from Tushita heaven,
Oh wow!
a place of pure joy.
Well,
And it's not the
that's
highest.
exciting.
It's not the highest of the sensual God realms,
Right.
but nonetheless.
Say that in order to become Buddha, you have to have the heavenly realm back.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
Well, for a Nirmanakaya Buddha. Yeah, ask your
Okay.
question again.
Oh,
Yeah, sorry. I keep forgetting about the mic.
No, I was just kind of asking about, so if all Buddhas go to that certain heaven,
Yeah.
that means that
Ganden, excuse me. That's the name of the head of the Gelugpa until modern times, was the head of Ganden monastery in Tibet that we drove by. And Ganden is Tushita. That's the Tibetan, how they translated
Tushita.
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 So it's where the Buddhas come from.
Hmm.
Yeah. All right. Sorry.
Well, no, the point of the question was, I guess in order to become a Buddha, you have to travel to other outside of
Yes.
the samsara of Earth.
Yeah.
And,
So in a
and
sense,
return.
it's not a worldly birth.
Right.
He's coming with pure mind, like that. Yeah.
Hmm.
Still has to go through all sorts of stuff. But all of that, Lama Tarshan also told me, I asked him once, well, here we have this story of the Buddha going through 3 eons of practicing bodhicitta and struggle and everything. And then lo and behold, by this tremendous merit that he built, erupts in Buddhahood.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the same time, people say that he was enlightened from the beginninglessness. So which is it, Lama Tarshan? He says it's both.
And
It all depends on us,
way, yeah.
our attitude towards this and what we need. Yeah. Okay. So let's, we'll just do the short dedication, and thank you. We'll come back for next time. Okay. Om mani padme hum hri. 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 Nirvani nududak chen rei guang drup jur chik druwa yuam malubha nei sala gom har shu. one last thought. I meant to, as this overview, talking about the emotions with these three vehicles, the Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana. The distinction is in the Hinayana, the basic practice is rejecting, again, not the emotions, but the afflictive emotions, rejecting the kleshas. In the Mahayana, we transform our negative into positive. And in the Vajrayana, we recognize the nature of the negative emotion itself. So just briefly to touch on that. What has that done? Well, in our meditation, when we're practicing, with concentration, and we see the emotions, the kleshas, the obstructions that come up, right? So first of all, we're learning to recognize them. And the basic thing is to not get entangled in it. So meditation is so powerful in the practice of it, because in our ordinary world, what happens? We're running around, some painful thought comes up and we're depressed or sad or whatever, or we react to it or whatever. But when you're meditating, especially with other people, so there's like kind of this social discipline, we're going to be doing this for the next 10 minutes, and I guess I can't really run out of here. You see it come up and torment you, but it's like a survival thing. Eventually you learn from the teachings and you start putting into practice to just not go there. And you also have the experience you can have some really strong negative thought just digging at you for, just 10 minutes. But then you think, well, when I get out of here, or if it's longer, especially, I get out of here tomorrow, I'm just going to do this, and this. You get a mental list that you're just lost in these kinds of thoughts. But, you're going to deal with that negative emotion. And then the meditation's over. Darn, I feel good. And you forget about it totally. It's like you can have this same experience where you have something that's really bugging you and you're waiting, and I'm going to ask Garchen Rinpoche about this, and then it's like, it takes you 2 months to get there or whatever. And you finally get there, and then you walk in and suddenly you forgot what you were there for. It's a tremendous lesson. But that's how we deal with the kleshas, the obstructions, these conflicting, afflictive emotions. But in the Mahayana, we transform them. So again, we've now practiced that same ability to recognize the arising of these things and recognizing them. Because most people, when they're like really lost in anger, they don't even realize they're angry. It's afterwards they say, man, I really lost it. It so completely colonizes the mind, and you're like a slave. You have to do whatever it tells you to do. But now we've recognized it. But in the Mahayana, then, we are training ourselves, anger, patience, hatred towards someone, loving kindness and compassion. You learn all these things in a conceptual way, but of course you don't practice them. It comes up in the same patterns going on. Slowly, though, the mind is trained. Now in the Vajrayana, you look right at that negative emotion. And with that clear awareness right on the emotion itself, it dissolves. And again, you can have that teaching, and it's very wonderful, but then you're doing that, and of course it never works. That's where faith and the persistence comes in. Because when you have a teacher like the teachers that we have, you can have faith that, okay, he's telling me true. So even though I seem to be fumbling around with it and still lost in my habits, I'm going to just continue to do this, even though it seems pointless. Like that became the Arhat sweeping the temple floor. He had faith in the Buddha, basically. And so he did it. Not a blind faith. Lama Tarchin once said that, with this practice of in the Vajrayana, there's Guru Yoga, and then there's the visualization practices, but they're very so close. But he said that practice of it's like you let your mind, like one of these cotton balls. My mother, used to do makeup and stuff, and she had these cotton balls that I always played with when I was a kid. I remember once soaking them in perfume once, and then I went outside and lit it. I think it was either I was a pirate or it was some past lifetime liking incense, at any rate. But he said, take one of those cotton balls and like your mind, and you rest it on a tabletop that lightly. So when the negative emotion comes up, you just rest your mind like a cotton ball on that thought, and it will dissolve. You can do it 10,000 times and nothing happens because we're that thick. But the one time that it does happen, amazing. And he said there's actually practices where the teacher will purposely enrage you or get some huge emotion going in you, because there's more energy in that emotion. He says lots of wood, lots of fire. Fire is wisdom. And then you can see the liberation that involves, that you get for nothing, just for your mind. So amazing. But if you don't know the teachings and you don't have the good karma of running into someone who you have faith in, who can teach it like that, ordinary beings running around circles, angering. I think if I hit the pillow, that's going to be good therapy for me. All these things everyone's out there trying to be happy. It's tragic. The good thing is that this actually works and it's time tested. It's been working for 2,500 years. That's good enough for me. If I'm playing basketball and Shaq comes out and tells me try doing it this way, I'm going to give him a little bit of credibility. Okay. All right. So thank you for that. We'll be back next week. See you then.